You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And welcome to an episode that we're going to call Ruminations with Bill and Kristin. Or like maybe pontifications?
I don't know. Okay.
I'm trying to come up with the right adjective, and I'm just not sure which it is. But between the two of us, it could be one or the either of those words.
What's the question we're asking today?
The question that we're talking about, it's actually two questions, and it came as the result of two articles that I saw and decided to share with you, since because they were in my head, it's only fair that they're in yours too.
Fair enough.
So the first article was about Nashville shooter Audrey Hale and about whether or not the manifesto that she wrote should be released to the public after the behavioral analysis unit is done with it at Quantico. I do remember initially they had indicated, yeah, we'll release this. But the article basically said, actually, we're going to maybe walk back on that a little bit. And the question was, should we be releasing this stuff for the general public to see? Like, of what value is there to see the, I guess in some case, rantings or ramblings of someone like James Holmes or Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, or in the most recent case, Audrey Hale. And I'm realizing as I'm saying the most recent case, that's not the most recent mass shooting. And that's actually really sad too.
Sadly, what's happening now is there are so many mass shootings in the United States, one after another, that I know both of us get confused in terms of which one are we talking about. And Nashville is not the latest mass shooting. We've had several mass shootings since. There's been an agreed upon definition that a mass shooting is someone who is shooting 4 or more people. And that's happening like every single week here in the U.S. and nowhere else on the planet. And we have to keep coming back to that because there are guns around the world. There are crazy people and disturbed people and mentally ill people around the world, some of whom might be violent. But there's nowhere else on the planet that we have this combination of guns and all of these other factors which are resulting in a mass shooting every single week.
It's crazy. The question of, do we release these manifestos? I think it's a valid question. I think it's an important question. Now, when we use the term manifesto, of course, what I think arises to everyone's mind is the Unabomber manifesto, which our good friend Jim Fitzgerald has talked about at length, including a couple of episodes on this podcast. I know when you and I were talking off air as we were kicking around this topic, we talked about the value of releasing the Unabomber manifesto, largely because it helped to catch the guy.
Let's talk about that for a minute. Just as a reminder, the Unabomber had been killing people for, I think, close to 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
From talking to Fitz. They were still desperate to find this person, and the FBI had been attempting to track him for years. The thinking was that in publishing the manifesto in 2 major newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, if I'm not mistaken, the idea was that perhaps someone would recognize the language, which was very unique, within this lengthy kind of scholarly document with an anti-technology slant. The hope was someone would recognize his language. And we can't forget this. That's exactly what happened.
Yes.
Now, Fitz and others within the FBI argued in favor of putting out the manifesto with this goal in mind. Look, if we put this out, there's a possibility that someone's going to recognize this language. What happens? his sister-in-law and then her husband, Ted Kaczynski's brother, both read the manifesto after it's published in major newspapers, and they realize this really sounds like the dissertation and other scholarly type documents that Ted Kaczynski had written. And then they contacted a lawyer who contacted the FBI as an intermediary and said, my clients think they know who might be sending out these bombs, and people have been maimed and killed. So it's, I think, very different in some ways. There was an idea which actually worked, which was, we think we might be able to identify this man and therefore hopefully capture him. That's a little different from these manifestos, and I put air quotes around it, that we're seeing from some of these recent mass killers.
When you look at mass shooters, even as early as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine shooters, they had the basement tapes, which they were actually really hoping that those tapes would be released. They never have been. And I believe you said before we went on the air, they'd actually been destroyed, were they not?
They were. I'd heard about the basement tapes before, which are a series of 8mm tapes. They were shot on camcorders. Remember, this is 1999.
Little mini cams.
Yeah, it sounds like a long time ago now. Apparently, the sheriff in Colorado made the decision to ultimately destroy the tapes with the support of the families who had lost loved ones at Columbine High School. Coming up to speed again on the basement tapes, hadn't read about them in a while. These two morons actually thought they were going to become famous, and they even discuss on the tapes who's going to play them in the movie and which filmmaker is going to make a movie about them. I think the last thing we want to do is be playing into the hands of these nut jobs who think this is going to be their way of going out in a blaze of glory by killing a whole bunch of people.
The idea, when I first read about the basement tapes, I was appalled just all the way around. And so you look at something like the basement tapes, you look at something like James Holmes' writing, James Holmes being the Aurora movie theater shooter. We get a sense of what his writings were from Carrie Drobin's book, Aurora. That also is not something, I think, that should be floating out and about in the world. It is, actually. You can read James Holmes. I don't think it's really a manifesto. I think it's just notebooks.
And I looked at the material in preparing for this broadcast. James Holmes, the Aurora shooter's notebook, is just filled with the ravings of a madman. He's just got the same word repeated over and over again on certain pages. Why? 30 or 40 times. Just that word and a question mark. There are places where he does discuss a bit more kind of planning of where he's going to lash out and where he's going to kill people. He considered airports. He considered a movie theater. And then finally he decided to attack a movie theater because that's much more vulnerable, much less security. So there may be some benefit to law enforcement. I'm not actually sure there's any public good, though, in releasing these manifestos.
Yeah, I think that it is one thing if you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist and you are looking to gain insight into the criminal mind, then absolutely. The BAU would have a vested interest in it. Psychologists would have a vested interest in it. But I don't think that it is something that needs to be broadcast for everyone to see. Now, as humans who are very invested in true crime culturally right now in the United States, are people going to be interested in what Audrey Hale had to say and why she decided to shoot up the Covenant School? Yes, probably people are going to be very interested. But do they need to see it chapter and verse in what is very likely the rantings of, as you said earlier, a mad person? I don't think we need to see that. I don't think we do.
Audrey Hale is dead. She was shot to death by Nashville Metropolitan Police officers responding to the mass shooting at the Covenant School. She's not going to go on trial. Mm-mm. In some of these examples, like James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, he actually went on trial. And so these materials were introduced as part of the legal proceeding, which is how they ended up in the public. Now, that you actually don't learn that much in the James Holmes example, and we don't know what's in Audrey Hale's notebooks. Apparently, she was incredibly organized and had all of these files and just a lot of material. I think that would probably be worth, as you said a moment ago, Kristin, law enforcement, profilers, the FBI, the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department, the Department of Justice, those people studying to see what's going on with mass shooters of this type and what was Audrey Hale thinking before she made the decision to go in and shoot up a school that she'd actually attended some years before and killed both students and teachers and administrators there. I'm not sure there's really much public benefit to that.
No, I don't think there is. I think that as a culture, we are very fascinated, sometimes unhealthfully so, with what goes on in the minds of killers. I think that if the benefit is to law enforcement and law enforcement alone, absolutely they should have access to it. But do the rest of us need to know the murky, dark things that are happening in the minds of the Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold's of the world? I'm going to sleep a whole lot better if I don't know that, I think.
And as you mentioned when we were off the air too, Kristin, some of the experts regarding the Klebold-Harris basement tapes had said they didn't want to see those released because they also talked in quite a bit of depth about their planning, what they went out and purchased in order to have weapons and explosives, what materials they purchased. They even videotaped themselves on the way to and from the various stores where they bought these things. They were buying civilian items and then working to turn those into explosive devices with some success. And as you pointed out, one of the law enforcement experts said this actually is a roadmap for someone who might want to commit a similar crime.
Yeah, it's a blueprint for any teenage copycat that decides they want their 10 minutes of fame the same way that Harris and Klebold got theirs. I don't think there's any reason why things like that need to be released to the public. Now, if you read, for example, Dave Cullen's Columbine, which is an excellent book, he does offer excerpts and things like that. And that's fine because it is all part of the narrative. But would I want to see what they put out there into the world released for everybody to read it? No, not at all. I don't think there's value to that. And it is just a roadmap. Like you said, it's a blueprint for the next person who wants to have notoriety to pick it up and go, you know what? That sounds like a great idea. Let's go.
There are transcripts available of the Dylan Klebold, Eric Harris basement tapes, word for word, what was said by these two individuals. In the interest of everyone's mental health, and I'm talking about the collective, the big we here.
Yes.
I don't know that we really need to see this stuff. Now, there may be people that are studying criminology, psychology. They may want access to transcripts of this series of 8mm tapes that the Columbine High School shooters made, but they don't need to see the tapes themselves.
Thanks.
And I think what the sheriff was trying to do, and as I mentioned, he had the full support of the families. They were perfectly fine with destroying the tapes because who wants to see those two losers forever boasting about what they were about to do? They shot these tapes over weeks, including just shortly before they actually committed the heinous acts that they brought to Columbine High School that day. As we both know, there's so much interest now in true crime. There's a lot of material that tends to leak. And so it ends up just all over the place. And of course, this wondrous tool, the World Wide Web that we all use and we're using as we record this podcast, it also allows for very quick distribution of often extremely disturbing material that most of us don't need to see.
One of the things that I remember very clearly from one of the crime cons that we went to in the last couple of years, I think it was New Orleans.
They have a tendency to blend together because they're all action-packed and with a lot of information. But
they do. I think this was New Orleans. It was Chris Darden speaking. Was that New Orleans?
He was pretty amazing, and I think that was New Orleans.
Yes. So I remember that he was doing his excellent presentation, which really was phenomenal. He's a great speaker.
Yeah, he is.
But I remember that in his PowerPoint, he included very graphic, unedited crime scene photos from the Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman murders. And I remember thinking, oh man.
And
I never wanted to see those.
I didn't either. And at the same time, I didn't recall those ever being shown publicly before.
No, they weren't. To the best of my knowledge, they weren't. And that's the sort of thing that there are people out there who, when they learn about this case for the first time, they go, ooh, let's see if there are crime scene photos. The same way that there are people who Google the Manson crime scene photos.
And people have contacted me, and they've actually asked me for copies of the Colonial Parkway murders crime scene photos, which were leaked by the FBI about 13 or more years ago. And I'm going to share them with oddball people that I've never met. There are times when I don't know what to say other than no.
Yeah, the number of times we've had that request is a little alarming. It's like, where do you get the idea that might be an actual okay request to make to the brother of a victim?
I mentioned to you at one point I was contacted by someone who was purporting to put together a museum about serial killers, and they wanted something of my sister's.
Alcatraz East, I think it was.
Yeah. Why in the world would you think that was an okay thing to ask? And I've expressed some regret here on Mind Over Murder at different times. We actually didn't end up with very much of the things that belong to Kathy. I'm not a big believer that things are important, but there are times when I think I would have liked a few more little mementos that would have reminded me of Kathy. And I think in retrospect, we made a bit of a mistake. We were in a kind of purging, giving away, boxing it up and shipping it off somewhere mode, mostly driven by my parents, which I understand. But I have regret now that, for example, we threw away hundreds of letters and cards that were sent by Kathy's friends, many of them from the Naval Academy and from the Navy. And they were lovely, and they contained funny stories and things that made them really love and care about Kathy. And my parents decided we needed to get rid of them. I think because perhaps they felt that they were too painful. Now, my brothers and I are sorry because we think it would be really lovely to have those things. I'm not saying I'd look at them every day or every week, but it'd be nice to have them in a box somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's odd and sometimes disturbing the way people will ask for things that are incredibly personal and often highly disturbing and expect, for example, to be able to read the rantings of an obviously crazy person or watch these videotapes recorded by these two killers.
And with regard to the crime scene photos, Bill and I have both seen them. They are not things that we want to see again. It's just not. I'm sure that there are people out there who are like, they're interested in it. They're invested in the case. They want to know more. Please believe me, you do not want to see what was done to these victims. You just don't, because once you see it, as you've said a number of times, Bill, and I can say too, you can't unsee it. It's not out of your head ever. It's there.
Yep.
It's there when I close my eyes. It's on the back of my eyelids. You can't unsee it. For every person who reaches out and is, hey, can I see the crime scene photos? It's, you don't want to do that to yourself. You just don't.
No, and on some level, I think to myself, I'm going to give you a polite answer, even though I don't really feel like giving you a polite answer. Because for people to say, oh, I want to see the crime scene photos because I'm interested, are you serious? It would be another thing if it was a law enforcement officer or somebody in behavioral analysis, someone that had a legitimate reason to want to study the crime scene photos. But for the most part, those people already have access to them.
And even when you and I started working together, it was a bit of a balancing act for me to try to figure out, okay, what details are appropriate for me to ask and what are not. And so for the first couple of years, it was always me prefacing conversations with, if you don't want to answer this, you don't have to, but And you've always been very generous. All of the family members have been very generous about sharing things and insights that are deeply personal. But it was really only within the last year that I saw those crime scene photos, and I wish to God I hadn't.
I know. They're very disturbing. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Among the articles that you shared with me over the last week or so as we were discussing putting this podcast together was a very powerful article from the New York Times. It was a magazine story from April 20th, 2023. We'll link to this in the show notes. I urge all of our listeners to read this story. And of course, the New York Times is not behind a paywall, thankfully. This article is incredibly powerful and moving. It focuses on 3 investigators who worked on the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012 in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, where 26 people were murdered. And it's a very powerful article. I don't think most of us will be able to get through it without shedding a few tears.
Oh, yeah.
But they talked about the impact that working that crime scene with 26 victims, what that was like for these pretty hardened professional people, but also people with hearts and souls and minds that, like you said, can't turn the images that they've seen off. They went home to their families and really struggled. They mentioned that there are 1,495 photos. That's almost 1,500 photos of the crime scene from Sandy Hook, most of which are so horrifying they've never been shown to the public. And they talked about being obligated to show them to Eric Holder, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, and a group of FBI agents and behavioral analysis people. Just the reaction of those individuals. And these are trained law enforcement people who've seen a lot, maybe have seen it all, as we have said. Many of them also had military experience and had seen combat. A number of people in this article actually said that the crime scene photos from Sandy Hook were worse than anything they'd ever seen, even in combat.
The slug line for this, it's very evocative, and it's just 2 sentences. They saw the horrific aftermath of a mass shooting. Should we?
It's a very powerful question.
It is. It was an extremely powerful article. As you said, I cried quite a few times, quite a bit while reading it. It does bring up a very interesting point. While we don't want to encourage the rantings and ravings of people who just want to get true crime famous by releasing the manifestos of mass shooters, should we be doing more to make sure that people understand the outcome of mass shootings? There's a lot of angles for this. Can we do that while still being respectful to the victims? I don't know. I'm not sure that you can do that when it's something like Sandy Hook, when you've got 26 victims and most of them are children. How do you do that? But at the same time, to be perfectly honest, and I remember exactly where I was when I heard about Sandy Hook. I was actually in the front office at my school where I teach now. And I remember thinking, if slaughtered children does not make this country change its stance on gun violence, I don't know what will. And the answer clearly is not that.
I'd have to agree. And my personal axis is always going to bend towards respect for victims.
Yeah.
I have a concern, however, and I think you're touching on this, which is for us as a society, if we don't actually see the damage and the physical damage that's being done by weapons of war, and I'm not talking about a standard handgun here, I'm talking about AR-15 style weapons or the Bushmaster rifle that was used by the shooter in Sandy Hook, if we don't actually see some of the physical damage, on some level we're being shielded, protected from the carnage that's happening in these mass shootings. I was shocked. I remember this happening, but I'd forgotten or perhaps blocked it from my mind that 16 little kids had crowded into the bathroom, which was 3 feet by 4 feet, and were all shot to death in that completely confined space. They weren't even able to fall to the ground. The investigators who had to work that crime scene for days were so horrified by what they'd seen and what that shooter and what that gun did to those little children, to the point where they weren't even recognizable as human beings. The level of just shocking injury to these little tiny kids is something that is going to haunt these people, all of these investigators, the medical examiners, everyone that worked this case for the rest of their lives. I'm actually wondering if there's got to be a way for us to come to understand how much damage is being done to these victims and to us as a society by these endless mass shootings.
Right after the Nashville Covenant School shooting, it was either the evening of or the day after, the Washington Post made what I think was a pretty bold step, and they produced a piece called The Blast Effect. It shows what AR-15 rounds do to the human body when it blasts through tissue, bones, and organs. And they did it in a way that's very interesting. They did not use crime scene photos, but they did some like 3D modeling where every time you scrolled up on the screen, there would be a picture of just a facsimile of a human body, no features or anything like that. And it would show the pattern of injuries obtained by, they chose 2 people from 2 school shootings. They picked a child from Sandy Hook and they picked a student who was killed at Parkland. They had gotten permission from both of these children's parents to use the injuries that happened to their kids as part of this article. They basically showed in real time when a child gets hit with 6 rounds from an AR-15, this is what happens. And I actually want to quote this thing from the Washington Post, really, because Washington Post printed a justification for why they did this. And so I want to quote from them real quick. The catastrophic damage the bullets from AR-15s cause inside human bodies is rarely made public in detail. News organizations do not generally publish graphic autopsy or crime scene photos because the images could be viewed as dehumanizing, exploitative, and traumatizing, or could inflict further pain on the families of victims. As a result, the damage AR-15 fire can do to a human body, a great deal more than handguns, is not widely understood. When we set out to chronicle the story of the AR-15 in America, we searched for ways to illustrate the effect on bodies in an unflinching but respectful manner. We recognize this presentation may disturb readers, but we determined the information it contains is crucial to the public's knowledge. And then it goes on from there. I like the fact that they did 2 things here, that they acknowledged we realize what it would do to these families to show these crime scene photos, but we also acknowledge that we have to make people aware of what happens when you hit the human body with this many high velocity rounds. The story definitely was divisive. I had a friend who posted it on Facebook, and then she edited her post to say, actually, you know what? I'm taking this link down because I don't want people to click on it and be traumatized, but I am going to tell you why you should read it. So she didn't provide the link, but she did say, here's the information, here's how you can Google it and find it, but I'm not going to link it because it's very upsetting. Like, she described how upset she got. It's an interesting conundrum, but ultimately, I think Washington Post deciding to produce that piece, it was upsetting, absolutely, but it was brave and it was necessary too, I think.
The article, The Blast Effect, ran in the Washington Post on March 27th, 2023. Before people complain that the Washington Post is hidden behind a paywall, this article is available for free on the Washington Post website. I just reconfirmed that. And the reason that they did that is because they want people to see this article. Now, you can read the material or not, but we're going to link to it The information is available, and it is an extremely powerful and, as you said, Kristin, disturbing article. But I think this information needs to be out there, because for us to go through one mass shooting after another, particularly now we have this whole series of mass shootings at schools and churches and synagogues and mosques and dance schools and just on, and yet we don't ever see much evidence of what actually transpired in these mass shootings. We're just seeing articles and we see pictures of first responders and ambulances and the fronts of buildings. We see the Uvalde Elementary School, but we don't see inside. And we certainly don't see the damage that's been done to the buildings, to the community, and most importantly, to the people.
I can already anticipate, because we get blowback whenever we talk about guns and gun violence and mass shootings. And there are people who don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it from us. As a teacher who deals every day with the disturbing realities that come with having guns in the school and with mass shootings being a regular thing, this is something that is constantly on my mind. And as Bill is the brother of a murder victim, we've got a lot of credibility wrapped up in this issue. When we talk about the idea of authentic reporting and reporting what is right, we talk about ethics in true crime. I think that not only do we have a right to talk about this, I think we have the responsibility to talk about it as true crime podcasters, as journalists. A friend laughed at me the other day. He was like, "You're not a journalist." Well, okay, fine. But I am here.
A podcaster.
Yeah, I am a podcaster, and I have a forum. We have a forum, and we have the right to speak about it. And more importantly, we have the responsibility to speak about it. So are we going to get blowback for this episode? Yeah, probably. We always do. I think if anybody has the right to speak out about it, it's people who live it within the true crime space.
We have always tried to be very respectful of the fact that our listeners come from a wide variety of backgrounds. First of all, you're all over the country, you're all over the world. Politically, it's the gamut from our most conservative friends to our most liberal friends, and lots of stops in between. I don't even know why I feel I need to say this. Understand, no one's coming for your guns. We're not proposing that anyone take away your guns. But if we as a country don't figure out how to do something, we're headed down a road here that is so excruciatingly painful and divisive. We've got to figure out a way for kids to be able to go to school safely. And then, as I was mentioning, all those other categories, and I'm just scratching the surface. You can't go anywhere now without being worried that you're going to be gunned down by a crazy person with an automatic weapon. Let me read from the AP for a moment. The U.S. is setting a record pace for mass killings in 2023, replaying the horror on a loop roughly once a week so far this year. The carnage has taken 88 lives in 17 mass killings over 111 days. Each time the killers wielded firearms. Only 2009 was marked by as many such tragedies in the same period of time. 88 lives, 17 mass killings in the first 111 days of this year. This is insane, and we can't keep doing this. We've got to figure out something. If people want to say that we're falling off the planet, lefty tree huggers, that actually is true when it comes to me.
But I would say you are, aren't you?
And I'm not embarrassed about that. But at the same time, we understand a lot of the people that we work with in law enforcement are coming at this from a much more conservative perspective. I am respectful, and I know, Kristin, you are too, of our friends and family that are coming at this from perhaps a more conservative, perhaps even pro-gun point of view. But I don't think it is bomb throwing in any way, shape, or form to say we have to do something together to figure out how to address this issue. And arming teachers isn't even a serious suggestion. So let's not even bother to go there. But I do think we need to take steps and work together. And if people want to say that we're communists or whatever, quite frankly, it probably means you don't know what you're talking about. All we're saying is we think we need to do something, and we need to do something now.
One of the other things that also came up when I read this piece, but particularly the New York Times piece about the incredibly brave law enforcement personnel who had to deal with the carnage at Sandy Hook. We need to be doing more as a country to address for the first responders and the families of victims, helping them get past the trauma that comes with living with something like this, whether it's responding to 16 young children crowded into a bathroom who have been shot to death, or whether it's a family member who has lost one person in their family to gun violence. We still, I think, need to be doing better as a country in terms of how can we support you? How can we help you? This is hard stuff to live through. And Bill, I know you can attest to that.
And I never signed on for this. I am not in law enforcement. I'm not an investigator. I'm not a cop. I have tremendous respect for our friends in law enforcement that do these jobs that many of us wouldn't have the heart to do. Me included. I would not be able to do this kind of gig.
No, not at all. And so whether it is all of us maybe learning a little bit more about trauma response and how to better help people who have been in a traumatic situation, or whether it's going a step bigger and reforming healthcare in this country so that mental health is not stigmatized and so that we have more options in terms of getting therapy or counseling or whatever the heck else it is that you need once you've had to deal with this. I think that's another step we need to take as a country. If we're going to deal out this level of violence, we need to figure out a way to support the people who have been impacted by it. That goes from me as someone who has been a victim of crime, you who is the brother of a murder victim. I can't think of a single person that I know within the true crime space who either hasn't been in some way, shape, or form touched by crime. I'm not advocating that we all get together and sing Kumbaya around a fire or anything like that, but I'm also thinking that probably wouldn't hurt for everybody to sit down and have a therapy session or something like that all together. It is hard to deal with. It is rough. The thing that nobody tells you when you deal with this, and again, I know you can attest to this, Bill, especially if you don't sign up for it, is you don't suffer just one time. It's not something that happens and then magically you wake up and you're better. You deal with it over and over again every single day. Your family's dealt with it for 35 years. I can't even imagine.
As we steer this episode to a close, I just want to summarize where I am, and then I'd like to hear, Kristin, if you're at the same place or not. We've always committed, by the way, that we don't have to agree on every little thing. I like the fact that we have different perspectives. I'll put this out from my point of view. Your mileage may vary. In thinking about these two issues for today's podcast, should law enforcement be releasing manifestos of this type? In thinking about it, I think the answer for me is no. Interestingly, the related question about whether or not we should be seeing more evidence of what's happening physically to our victims in these mass shootings, as long as we can do this in a way that's respectful of victims and victims' families, and I know this is a hard one, I actually think we may want to be thinking about finding ways to allow people to see the horrific damage that's being done by these weapons of war. So I'm actually leaning towards perhaps allowing some limited public and media viewing of what is actually happening to these victims, because I think people would be shocked. And what I hope would happen is they would be galvanized into taking active steps to do something about gun violence here in the U.S.
I'm with you on, I'm like 95% of that. I do agree that yes, the manifestos, the rantings, the ravings, the whatever you want to call it for mass shooters, We don't need to be putting that out there. Are we going to be curious about what was in Audrey Hill's notebooks? Yeah, absolutely. But do we need to see it? No. If the FBI says, hey, we don't want to release it because we don't think it's a good idea, I'll respect your opinion. We probably don't need to release it. We don't need to see it. The crime scene photo issue is harder because, as you said, it would have to be done respectfully. I'm not sure what that would look like. So I'm always a little hesitant to agree to something without knowing in full how would this look. I'm all about planning an organization, and I don't like agreeing to things if I don't know how it's going to work out. In terms of wake-up calls, might be a good one. But the cynical part of me is afraid and does not want to see what would happen if people looked at that and were like, I'd still rather have my gun. And I know that there would be people who would react that way. And I don't know if my bruised little heart can take that. I don't know that I could deal with that, especially from people that I know and love who they like their guns, protective of their guns. And I've told them, I'm not the mean liberal here to take away your gun. You can have your gun, and I'm fine with that. I don't know how I would feel if someone that I really, truly loved saw those crime scene photos and said, you know what, that doesn't matter to me, because it matters to me. I find myself in a really weird place right there.
The appropriate compromise might actually be articles like The Blast Effect in the Washington Post, which managed to be descriptive and informative without necessarily being horrifically graphic because they were illustrations.
Yeah.
We'll recommend the New York Times article and the Washington Post articles as both very much worth our listeners' time.
I would also add to that, if you know that this is something that is going to greatly upset you, then please use your own best discretion and don't put yourself through something that you don't feel like you have the emotional capacity to handle right then. I definitely wish that I had waited a day or two before I looked at the Washington Post article. It was very necessary. It was something that I needed to see, but I didn't have good dreams that night. It stayed there in the back of my head, and all I ended up having that night was gun-related nightmares. So know where you're at and where you're coming from before you embark on these particular articles. And if you need to use discretion, I would say err on the side of using discretion.
I think we should steer to a close.
That's going to wrap it up for Ruminations with Bill and Kristin. We've got to come up with a better title for this, I think. But I feel like this is what you would get if you were to ask the two of us to coffee. We would talk about these things. We would do it with a caffeinated beverage and maybe a scone or two. But this is what you would get if you had Bill and I for coffee. Hopefully this has at least been a slightly illuminating experience for you.
As you were saying that, I thought to myself, we could change it from ruminations to disturbing thoughts with Kristin and Bill.
Disturbing conversations with Kristin and Bill. Disturbing but necessary conversations with Kristin and Bill. We'll figure out some sort of title for this, but we do hope that you have enjoyed spending a little bit of time with the two of us today. If you like what we're doing with the podcast, please do make sure that you leave us a 5-star rating and review on any of your podcast platforms. Do check us out on social media. And we do still have merchandise, by the way, over at TeePublic. Please do feel free to buy some Mind Over Murder merchandise. We love seeing you at CrimeCon and various other places in that merch. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.